Clouds in pixel art are always a challenge. You'll inevitably go online after a couple attempts and find so many people creating insanely good skies and wonder, how do they do that? Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Mochibeans channel. I'm Caden, and today I will show you how to make pixel art clouds, which don't look like what I did when I knew none of the information I'm about to tell you. Okay, so, clouds. Clouds are pretty strange when it comes to drawing them because they don't necessarily have a fixed shape, and light and shadow work a bit differently on them. So firstly, I'm going to go through how they differ. When you shade or texture some character art, for example, more often than not, you have already added in colours and are just focusing on which points get hit by light or casting shadow to enhance the form or integrity. Clouds are different in this case, because as you can see, a lot of their shape comes from how you do the lighting, rather than the lighting just supporting the structure. If I remove the shading, it's just a silhouette, and much of the structure is lost. This is why you have to use a slightly different process for clouds. Now that you have an idea of the differences between drawing solid objects and things like clouds, let's get started from the basics, step by step. Firstly, the form. How do you make a fluffy silhouette? Well, when I draw clouds, I normally start by blocking in basic rounded shapes. I'm looking for where I want certain things to be, as placement is very important. This step doesn't worry about individual pixels, but more so the form of the entire mass. Even at this stage, I've started thinking about where certain areas can protrude out towards the camera, and where other sections will be cast in shadow. You can see that I'm leaving large spaces for these to go, and it will be clearer in the colouring and depth stage how these areas are used. This step shouldn't be too difficult, and you should be free and loose with your shapes. Also, it will be good to note that clouds aren't just one large, massive clump, so everything isn't connected, and there'll be sections which are smaller than the main mass nearby. Okay, so at the moment we basically just have a bunch of large circles. So the next step is adding the lumps and cloud-like formations to the outline. This can be done using pretty much any tool, like using the circle tool, but I still prefer to keep it quite free and less clear-cut, so I'm going to stick with the pencil. As well as this, you can also erase sections with the normal eraser or even a custom brush, and get some interesting shapes going. However, make sure to keep most of them soft and round. To add more interest and diversity, I also tend to add tails or areas where the clouds trail off. This is technically optional, but I definitely think it adds to the overall shape of the cloud, and it gives you an idea of what it's meant to be. This is a good time to mention that these clouds I'm drawing tend to look much more like cumulus clouds, the larger, fluffier ones, rather than the thinner ones such as stratus clouds. However, you could easily modify the steps to make other types, such as making your form much vaguer than I have, to give differences in effects. This is basically the full silhouette done, and now it's time to add colour. For this, I heavily recommend a colour palette, preferably 4 to 5 different hues, so you have enough to work with, while keeping it pretty simple. I'll be using these pastel colours, and if you're making your own colour palette, don't forget to hue shift. If you don't know what hue shifting is, it's basically how artists don't just change the brightness of the colour when they make new shades or tints, but also the saturation and hue. To make a lighter colour, decrease the saturation and typically shift it towards a more reddish tint. And with darker colours, normally used for shadows, shift it towards a bluer or purpler tint, while increasing the saturation. This will make your art feel much more vibrant or alive. There is a science behind it, and it's roughly to do with us in real life seeing sunlight lighting objects, which isn't completely white, so it will change the colour slightly, but I won't really get into that in this video. Anyway, you can see that my highlight colours are looking much warmer and orange than my shadow colours, and although they're a bit overdone here to make it easier for you guys to see, the effect still works really well. Now, this is where things become slightly trickier, as it requires much more thought and placement. I recommend something similar to what you did in the first step, where you go onto a new layer and just try and roughly mark out the areas which seem like they're being blocked from light by another part of the cloud. You must have a consistent light source, otherwise this technique won't work. So just keep a mental note of where the sun or your light source is in the image, or even draw it on to make it more obvious. Just carry on blocking shadows out loosely, then afterwards, go back and polish them. Try to visualize the depth of the cloud. So don't just think of it as a flat plane, but think of it having a third dimension. I'll give you an example. Look at this area on my cloud. It's quite blank currently and is also one of the areas I left for more detail in the blocking out phase. Even though there's nothing which seems to cast a shadow, if I add a shadow anyway, it starts to look like there's an extra lump there. This is what I mean when I say thinking about it in the third dimension, and is one of the things a lot of beginners miss. You can create an image within a person's mind just by putting an impression of it there, i.e. the shadow, and this applies to lots of things, such as drawing a few strokes onto a shape to give the impression of wood boughs in the grain, or adding vague lines onto a surface, which the viewer fills in with their mind and sees it as stone. The reason you'd want to use this technique is normally because a single pixel is too large to convey smaller details in the pixel art, and so you just give a rough shape or impression. Anyway, back to clouds. During this color and depth phase, you can also mix in some darker colors from your palette and experiment with more intense shadows. These help with adding more depth overall and gives the feeling of a gradient-like lighting. That step is honestly the one that most people find really difficult, as you can get results anywhere from an aesthetic sunset to a messed up 90s wallpaper. So now for the larger shadows and overall texturing. This is where the majority of the polish begins, as your aim is to make it look organic and still detailed enough. You can see that the shadows in my art are also starting to move on from just being blobs to cloud-like shapes. This means everything keeps a consistent texture, which is always important in a large-scale artwork like this one. Adding larger shadows gives the desired effect of things further away from the light source, being just in general darker than those closer. Now I'm just polishing and adding in the final details, like the flat sky color, and that's basically it. Clouds are pretty easy the more you practice them, which I will definitely do more of, and you should keep practicing them too. If you drew any clouds using this tutorial, it would be really awesome if you showed us on our Discord server. Thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something. I'll see you later. Bye!